On December 14, 1962, a prison ferry crossed San Francisco Bay carrying a single inmate. Nothing about the transfer looked unusual, except for one detail. The prison he was heading to had already been condemned. In 3 months, it would close forever. Somehow, out of every federal penitentiary in the country, officials chose to send this one man to a fortress already scheduled for extinction. His name was Frank C. Weatherman. He stepped off that ferry with no idea he was about to become the last inmate ever admitted to Alcatraz. But why? Why would the government send a brand new prisoner to an institution already scheduled for demolition? The answer begins with what made Alcatraz different in the first place. Alcatraz opened as a federal penitentiary in 1934, built on a windswept island in the middle of San Francisco Bay, surrounded by cold water and stronger currents than most people realized. It was never meant to hold ordinary criminals. Federal prisons across the country were filled with men who broke rules, who fought guards, who tried to escape again and again. Alcatraz existed for the ones nobody else could control. It was not a first stop. It was where a man ended up after every other prison had already failed to hold him. Some of the names that passed through its gates became legends. Al Capone spent time there, stripped of the empire he once ran from behind bars. George Kelly, the gangster the newspapers called Machine Gun Kelly, lived out years inside its walls. Robert Stroud, known to the world as the Birdman of Alcatraz, became one of its most infamous long-term residents. These men gave Alcatraz its reputation, the myth of an inescapable island fortress built to break the will of America's most dangerous criminals. But Alcatraz was never really about rehabilitation. It was about control. It existed to hold the prisoners no other institution wanted to deal with, and that single fact is the reason Frank Weatherman ended up there at all. Life inside Alcatraz followed a rhythm unlike any other federal prison. Every inmate had his own cell, a small mercy compared to the crowded, shared cells common elsewhere, but the isolation of the island itself never changed. Prisoners could sometimes hear the sounds of the city drifting across the water, the hum of San Francisco going about its life just over a mile away, close enough to see, impossible to reach. Frank Clay Weatherman was born on October 29, 1934, in Forsyth, Missouri. He was not a gangster. He was not a household name. He was, in the language of the federal system, a career criminal, a man with a long list of convictions and a pattern of behavior that eventually caught the attention of federal officials. His crimes included armed robbery, and records list an additional charge tied to contributing to the delinquency of a minor. He was not known for violence in the way Capone or Kelly were known. He was known for something else entirely. He simply would not stay put. While being held in Anchorage, Alaska, Weatherman attempted to escape not once but twice. To the men who ran the federal prison system, that kind of persistence was its own kind of danger. It did not matter that his crimes lacked the notoriety of the men who came before him. What mattered was that he had proven, twice, that ordinary custody could not hold him. That pattern was enough. Prison officials decided he needed maximum security, the kind of security that only one place in the federal system was built to provide. On December 14, 1962, Frank Weatherman made the crossing to Alcatraz. He would have felt the same cold wind coming off the bay that thousands of prisoners before him had felt, the kind of wind that cuts through a jacket before the boat even reaches the dock. He would have gone through the same routine, the ferry ride across the water, the processing inside the intake area, the fingerprints taken and filed, the prison clothing issued, the walk to his assigned cell inside the aging cell house. Behind him, the steel gate closed with the same heavy sound it had made for 28 years, though this time it closed on a new inmate for what would turn out to be the very last time in the prison's history. To him, it likely felt like just another transfer, another prison, another cell door closing behind him. What he did not know, what nobody bothered to tell him that day, was that he had just become inmate AZ-1576, the final prisoner number ever issued at Alcatraz. He had walked into a place already scheduled for extinction. He would spend the final months of Alcatraz's existence inside a prison that the government had already agreed to shut down, and he had no idea that history had just quietly attached itself to his name. To understand why Alcatraz was closing at all, you have to look past the myths of escape attempts and criminal legends and look instead at something far less dramatic: money. Alcatraz was extraordinarily expensive to run. Every single item needed on the island, food, fuel, supplies, even fresh water, had to be shipped in by boat. Nothing about its location made operations easy or affordable. The buildings themselves were falling apart. Decades of exposure to salt air and ocean spray had eaten away at the structural steel and concrete, corroding pipes, weakening walls, and turning basic maintenance into a constant, expensive battle against the sea itself. An engineering study commissioned by the Bureau of Prisons concluded that fixing the crumbling infrastructure would cost millions of dollars and take years to complete. The daily cost of holding a single prisoner at Alcatraz was several times higher than at a typical federal penitentiary. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy ultimately approved the closure, backing the recommendation from the Bureau of Prisons that continuing to operate the island simply did not make financial sense. Many people assume the famous 1962 escape attempt by Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers is what finally sealed Alcatraz's fate. That escape did draw enormous public attention, and it certainly did nothing to help the prison's reputation. But the decision to close Alcatraz was already rooted in cost and deterioration long before that escape captured the nation's imagination. By the time Frank Weatherman arrived in December of 1962, the outcome had already been settled on paper. He was walking into the final chapter of a story that had already been written. The closure did not happen all at once. Officials began quietly reducing the population months before the final announcement, transferring inmates in small groups to other federal institutions. The first chain of prisoners left for Leavenworth in September of 1962. At its fullest, Alcatraz typically held somewhere between 260 and 275 men. By the time Weatherman arrived that December, the cell house that had once held hundreds was already emptying out, corridor by corridor, down toward the 27 men who would make the final crossing 3 months later. Officials had also approved construction of a new maximum security facility in Marion, Illinois, designed to take over the role Alcatraz had filled for nearly 3 decades, holding the inmates whose behavior made ordinary custody impossible. In many ways, Marion was built to inherit the very purpose that had defined Alcatraz since 1934, and some of the men who left the island that final winter would go on to fill its cells. There is one more detail buried in the paperwork worth pausing on. His inmate number, AZ-1576, was the final admission number ever issued at Alcatraz. Whatever else history remembers about the island, the count of names in its admission log ends with his. Just over 3 months later, on March 21, 1963, that story reached its end. Guards spent the final days packing up records, boxing files, and preparing to shut down operations for good. Prisoners were gathered in groups and marched down the walkway known as Broadway inside the cell house for the last time. Cells that had held some of the country's most notorious criminals stood empty, doors left open, never to hold another inmate again. 27 men made that final walk down to the dock, handcuffed, wearing leg and waist chains, boarding the prison boat known as the Warden Blackwell for a short 10-minute crossing across the bay. Frank Weatherman was among them, and when the moment came to identify the very last man to step off Alcatraz forever, it was him. He had entered last, now he was leaving last. A reporter waiting at the dock asked him how it felt to be the final man off the rock. Weatherman offered no dramatic speech, no defiance, no bitterness aimed at the system that had held him. He simply said that Alcatraz was never any good for anybody. A quiet, almost tired verdict from the one man who had the unusual distinction of experiencing both the beginning and the end of Alcatraz's final chapter in its history. Not every man on that boat felt the same relief. Several of the men transferred that day were headed to institutions with shared cells holding 4 or 5 inmates at once, a crowded existence far removed from the solitary routine Alcatraz had offered. One guard who had worked on the island for years was given the task of personally escorting Weatherman down to the dock, marking the end of his own long assignment on the rock alongside the end of the prison itself. A few moments after the boat pulled away, an officer climbed the lookout tower and formally closed it down, switching off a post that had been staffed around the clock for 29 years. From there, Weatherman continued serving his sentence at other federal institutions, eventually arriving at the penitentiary in Atlanta. Unlike Capone or the Birdman, he never became a cultural icon. He did not inspire films or spark decades of public fascination. He simply lived out the rest of his life away from the spotlight. A man who became historically significant not because of the scale of his crimes, but because of the accident of timing that placed his name at both ends of Alcatraz's closing chapter. Weatherman died in January of 1999, decades after his brief moment in the national newspapers, having spent most of his later life entirely outside of public view. Alcatraz itself did not disappear after the last boat pulled away. The island sat empty for years, its buildings left to the wind and salt air that had already been eating away at them for decades. In 1972, it was brought under the care of the National Park Service, open to the public as part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. Today, tourists walk the same corridors Weatherman once walked, looking out through the same barred windows at the same view of San Francisco that so many inmates could see but never reach. Few of them know his name, or that he arrived only 3 months before the doors closed for good. Thousands of prisoners passed through Alcatraz across its 29 years as a federal penitentiary. Some became legends whose names are still recognized today. Others faded into the background of history, remembered only in prison records and yellowed newspaper clippings. But the final name ever written into Alcatraz's admission log was not a notorious gangster, nor a master escape artist whose story would be turned into a Hollywood film. It was Frank C. Weatherman, a man whose only real distinction was being the last one through the gate and the last one to walk away from it. Without knowing it, Frank Weatherman was not just entering another prison that December morning. He was walking into the final chapter of one of America's greatest criminal legends. He was the last inmate admitted. He was the last inmate to leave. The final name ever written into Alcatraz's admission records, closing a chapter that began with Al Capone and ended with a quiet armed robber from Missouri that almost nobody remembers today. Frank C. Weatherman, last inmate admitted to Alcatraz, December 14, 1962. Last inmate to leave, March 21, 1963. A quiet name attached to the closing of one of the most infamous prisons in American history. Do you think Alcatraz deserved its reputation as America's most inescapable prison, or was its legend bigger than the reality behind those walls? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Dead Empires for more.